Chapter 1. The Depths Where Voices Fade. Far below the reach of storms, where sunlight arrived only as a memory, the sea held its quiet like a secret. This was not the silence of absence. It was the silence of layers, water pressing upon water, current folding into current, time slowed by weight and distance. Sound traveled differently here. It softened. It lost its sharp edges. Even grief, when carried this deep, arrived gentler than it did on the surface. The merfolk called this region the Stillwater, and it lay beyond the coral palaces and the singing gardens, past the places where laughter still rang clear. Here, voices faded naturally, not by force, but by choice. It was in this quiet that Maris often lingered. She was the youngest daughter of the Sea King, though titles meant little to her. Crowns rusted quickly in salt, and hierarchy dissolved where pressure was constant. Her sisters swam higher, where light still danced and music traveled freely. They delighted in voices, in songs that curved through water like ribbons. Maris preferred the depths. She drifted slowly through the still water, her movements unhurried, her long hair floating around her like ink dissolving in blue. The sea here pressed close, embracing rather than crushing. Every motion felt deliberate, considered, as though the ocean itself wished to remind her that nothing needed to be rushed. Above her, faint echoes traveled downward, songs from the upper currents, laughter carried thin and distorted. They reached her like memories half forgotten. Maris listened without longing. She had once loved singing. As a child, she had followed her sisters through choral halls, her voice bright and clear, eager to be heard. The Sea King had smiled when she sang, proud and pleased. The court had applauded, the sound of clapping shells and chiming pearls ringing warmly through the water. But as Maris grew, something in her shifted. The songs began to hurt. Not her throat, her heart. Every melody stirred something too sharp, too exposed. Each note felt like opening a door she did not yet know how to close. Where her sisters sang and felt joy, Maris sang and felt weight. So she sang less. And then slowly not at all. No one forbade it. No one scolded her. The Sea King noticed, of course. Fathers always do, but he said nothing. He only watched as his youngest daughter drifted lower and lower, choosing quieter waters. In the still water, Maris found peace. The sea pressed against her ears, muffling sound until even her own thoughts softened. She could feel her heartbeat slow, her breath deepen. Here, there was no expectation to perform, no audience waiting to be pleased. Only the steady, ancient rhythm of the ocean. She often rested near the silent kelp, long strands of dark green that swayed gently without whispering. Fish passed through in calm schools, their scales duller here, their movements slower. Even the current seemed to respect the quiet, flowing without turbulence. Maris closed her eyes and let herself drift. She did not know how long she remained there. Time behaved strangely in the depths, but eventually, a familiar presence brushed against the edge of her awareness. Her sister Lyrene. Lyrene's voice reached her before her form did, faint but recognizable. "Maris," she called softly, careful not to let the sound carry too sharply. Maris opened her eyes. Lyrene swam into view, her movements graceful, her expression warm but tinged with concern. Light clung to her more readily than it did to Maris, refracting along her hair and scales. "You've been down here all morning," Lyrene said. Maris smiled faintly and signed back with her hands, movements fluid and practiced. "I like it here." Lyrene sighed gently. "Father worries." Maris tilted her head, curious but unbothered. "About what?" "That you're disappearing," Lyrene replied. "That you'll forget how to be heard." Maris considered this. Maybe forgetting isn't always a loss, she signed. Lyrene studied her sister carefully. "You used to love singing." I used to love being quiet too, Maris replied. Lyrene reached out and took Maris's hand, squeezing it gently. The upper currents are beautiful today. Sunlight everywhere. The surface is calm. Maris felt the familiar tightening in her chest at the word surface. She did not look away, but her grip on Lyrene's hand loosened slightly. I know. You're allowed to stay, Lyrene said quickly, sensing the shift. I just thought you might want to remember what it sounds like. Maris looked around the still water, the dark blue vastness, the slow-moving kelp, the quiet that held her so carefully. I remember, she signed. I just don't need it. Lyrene did not argue. She never did. Instead, she kissed Maris's forehead gently, a gesture older than language, and pushed upward, her form gradually fading into the brighter water above. Maris remained. She drifted deeper still, until even echoes disappeared entirely. In the absolute quiet, she noticed something new. A vibration. At first it was subtle, a disturbance traveling downward through layers of water, irregular and foreign. Not a song. Not speech. Something rougher, more fractured. Maris opened her eyes and listened with her body rather than her ears. The vibration came again. She followed it upward cautiously, curiosity pulling her higher than she usually ventured. As she ascended, sound sharpened gradually, the water thinning, light growing brighter. The vibration resolved into chaos. Shouting, wood cracking, metal screaming against itself. A storm. Maris reached the underside of the surface just as a shadow passed overhead. A vessel caught in violent waves, its hull splitting, its mast snapping like bone. She watched as figures fell into the sea, their movements frantic, their voices sharp with fear. One figure sank faster than the others. A young man, his limbs heavy, his body pulled downward by soaked cloth. His mouth opened, a cry escaping in a burst of bubbles that tore through the water painfully loud. Maris winced. Without thinking, she swam toward him. She caught him before the sea could claim him fully, wrapping her arms around his chest, steadying his descent. His body trembled, his heartbeat wild against her palm. She dragged him upward just enough to bring his face into a pocket of calmer water beneath a piece of wreckage. His breathing was ragged. His eyes fluttered open briefly, unfocused. Maris held him there, her presence steady, her silence deliberate. The storm raged above them. The sea roared, but between them, there was a quiet, fragile, temporary, but real. The young man's breathing slowed. His eyes closed. Maris felt something unfamiliar stir within her chest. Not pain, not longing, but a question. She had always believed silence was an escape. But now, holding someone whose world was nothing but noise and fear, she wondered, what if silence could also be a gift? The sea surged again, and Maris knew she could not stay. Carefully, gently, she guided the young man toward the surface, pushing him upward until his fingers brushed air and wreckage alike. When she was certain he would float, she released him. She did not look back. She descended quickly, sound fading, light thinning, the storm's chaos dissolving into the muted calm of deeper water. By the time Maris reached the still water again, her heart was racing. She rested among the silent kelp, pressing her hand against her chest, trying to understand what she felt. Above her, the surface world would remember the storm as violence. Below, she would remember it as the moment silence met suffering, and did not turn away. For the first time in a long while, Maris wondered not what she had lost by giving up her voice, but what it might cost her to use it again. And deep in the quiet of the still water, the sea listened, patient, ancient, and waiting. Chapter 2: The Surface That Hurts to Hear. Maris did not return to the still water immediately. She hovered instead at the edge of the upper currents, where the sea still breathed loudly, where sound pressed against her senses like wind against bare skin. The storm had passed, but its echoes lingered, broken timbers knocking together, distant shouts, the restless churn of water refusing to settle all at once. She had never stayed this high for long before. Here, everything felt sharper, brighter, less forgiving. Light pierced the water in fractured beams, striking her eyes with a brilliance that made her blink. Every sound arrived whole and unsoftened, the slap of waves against floating wreckage, the cries of seabirds circling above, the groan of wood surrendering to the tide. Maris wrapped her arms around herself, steadying her breath. She told herself she had done what was necessary. She had guided the human to safety. She had not spoken. She had not crossed any line her father had warned against. The sea remained her home. And yet she did not descend. Something held her there, not urgency, not longing, but an unsettled awareness that the quiet she loved had been disturbed in a way she could not undo simply by swimming deeper. She rose just enough for her eyes to break the surface. Air struck her senses like a blow. It was cold and sharp, slicing into her lungs with a violence water never carried. She gasped instinctively, ducking back beneath the waves before she could fully register the sound of her own breath. Too loud, too raw, too exposed. Her heart hammered. She surfaced again more cautiously, drawing in air slowly this time, allowing her body to adjust. The world above was gray and restless, the sky heavy with retreating clouds. Debris floated everywhere, planks, cloth, fragments of a life that had belonged to the sea only moments ago. And there, clinging to a broken beam, was the young man. He was alive. Maris felt the certainty of it immediately. His chest rose and fell unevenly, his arms wrapped tightly around the wood as though letting go would invite the sea to reclaim him. His hair clung darkly to his face, plastered there by salt and fear. She stayed beneath the surface, watching. She had no intention of approaching again. Her role was finished. The surface world had its own rules, its own rescues. Humans saved humans. But then the young man stirred. He coughed violently, water spilling from his mouth, his grip tightening on the beam. He looked around wildly, his eyes scanning the debris-filled water, searching for something, someone. Maris felt an unexpected pang. Not sympathy alone. Recognition. He was listening. Not just with his ears, but with his entire body, the way one listens when silence has been ripped away and replaced with chaos. She had known that feeling once, long ago, before she had learned to seek quieter depths. She surfaced again, this time farther away, keeping the broken beam between them. The sound of her movement caught his attention. Turned. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Maris froze. She had always imagined that if a human ever saw her, there would be fear, or wonder, or hunger for story. Instead, there was only exhaustion. The young man stared at her as if his mind could not quite decide whether she was real. His brow furrowed, his grip slackened slightly, then tightened again. "You?" he said hoarsely. The words scraped across the air, harsh and unrefined. Maris flinched. The sound hurt, not physically, but deeply, the way sudden noise shatters fragile calm. Her instinct was to dive, to vanish back into the water where voices softened and meaning dissolved. But she stayed. The young man swallowed, coughing again. "Did you?" His voice broke. Maris did not answer. She only watched him, her expression careful, guarded. He seemed to understand, somehow. His gaze dropped from her face to the water between them, as if suddenly aware of the impossibility of the moment. "I must be," he shook his head weakly, "hallucinating." Maris felt something tighten inside her chest. She did not want to be an illusion. Before she could stop herself, she raised one hand slowly above the water's surface, not waving, not beckoning. simply existing. The young man's eyes widened. He inhaled sharply, then winced at the sound of it. "You're real." The word landed heavily between them. Maris let her hand sink back beneath the surface, the water swallowing her fingers gratefully. She did not nod. She did not confirm. She turned away. The moment stretched. When she glanced back again, the young man was still watching her, his gaze softer now, less frantic. "Thank you," he said quietly. The sound was still loud, still sharp, but there was something different in it. A restraint. As if he were learning, instinctively, to speak without tearing the air apart. Maris hesitated. She lifted her hand again and pressed it lightly against her chest, then gestured toward him, then toward the distant shore barely visible through the haze. A simple exchange. "You live..." He followed her gesture, understanding dawning slowly across his face. "Yes," he said. "I can make it." Maris nodded once. She did not wait to see him succeed. She slipped beneath the surface, the water closing around her like a bomb. Sound softened immediately. The sharp edges dulled. Her breathing steadied. She descended, but not as far as before. The upper currents still pressed close, their noise muted but present. She felt suspended between two worlds, one too loud, one too quiet. When she finally reached the coral shelves below, her sisters were waiting. Lyrene swam toward her at once, concern etched into her features. "You were near the surface," she said, not accusing, simply stating a truth that worried her. Maris nodded. "You helped him," Lyrene continued gently. Maris hesitated, then signed. "I didn't speak." Lyrene smiled faintly. "You didn't need to." They swam together back toward the palace, their path winding through familiar halls of coral and pearl. The songs of the court reached Maris faintly now, voices raised in harmony, celebratory and clear. They hurt more than before. Maris drifted away from them, settling near a column where the sound softened enough to bear. Her sisters joined the gathering, but Lyrene lingered beside her. "You're troubled," Lyrene said. Maris signed slowly, her movements precise. "The surface is loud." Lyrene nodded. "It always has been." "It doesn't have to be cruel," Maris signed. "But it doesn't know how to be gentle." Lyrene studied her sister with new seriousness. "And you think you can teach it?" Maris did not answer immediately. She thought of the young man's voice, raw, breaking, then careful. Of how he had softened without being asked. "I don't want to teach it," she signed at last. "I just don't want to run from it anymore." That night, Maris lay awake in her chamber carved from pale stone and coral. The palace slept around her, its songs fading into memory. She pressed her hands against her ears, not to block sound, but to hold herself steady against it. Above her, the surface world continued, loud, relentless, alive. For the first time, Maris did not retreat deeper. She hovered where the noise was bearable, listening just enough to remember why she had fled, and why she might one day return. And somewhere beyond the waves, a human who had nearly drowned lay awake as well, haunted not by terror, but by the quiet gaze of a girl who had never spoken, and had still been heard. Chapter 3: The Price of Sound. Maris dreamed of noise. Not the wild clamor of the storm, nor the sharp, painful crash of air against her lungs, but something subtler, more unsettling. In her dream, sound did not strike. It lingered. It pressed softly but insistently, like a tide that never quite receded. She drifted through corridors of coral where voices echoed without bodies. Songs she had once known floated past her, distorted and slowed, their melodies stretched thin. Each note carried weight, not beauty. Each harmony felt like a hand resting too long on her shoulder. She woke with her heart racing. The sea around her chamber was calm, dimly lit by bioluminescent patterns along the walls. For a moment, she did not move. She listened, not outward but inward, cataloging the sensation that still hummed faintly through her chest. It was not fear. It was anticipation. Maris rose and swam slowly from her chamber, moving through the palace halls before the court fully stirred. At this hour, the coral corridors were nearly silent. Guards drifted at their posts, their movements lazy and unthreatening. Pearlescent fish glided through open archways, their scales catching what little light there was. She followed a familiar path downward and outward, toward a place few visited willingly. The Hall of Currents. It lay at the boundary between the palace and the open sea, a vast chamber where the water flowed faster, louder, more insistently. Here, sound gathered rather than faded. Conversations sharpened. Songs carried farther. It was where messengers trained their voices and where proclamations were made. Maris had avoided it since childhood. She paused at the threshold, her hands clenched at her sides. The water vibrated faintly with distant voices, their echoes layering atop one another. She took a breath and entered. The sound hit her immediately, not violently, but thoroughly. Voices rippled through the chamber, bouncing off stone and coral alike. Even the currents seemed louder here, their movement more forceful, more present. Maris flinched. Her instinct screamed at her to retreat, to flee back to the depths where sounds softened into suggestion. But she stayed, anchoring herself by gripping the edge of a stone pillar. She was not here to sing. Not yet. She was here to remember. A voice rose nearby, one of her sisters, practicing a ceremonial hymn. The notes were clear and strong, shaped carefully to travel long distances. The sound brushed against Maris like cold water. Her chest tightened. She closed her eyes and focused on the rhythm of the currents instead, letting their steady push ground her. Slowly, the sharpness dulled. The noise became something she could endure. After a time, she realized she was no longer gripping the pillar quite so tightly. Lyrene noticed her then. She swam toward Maris with cautious concern, her voice lowered instinctively as she drew near. "You're brave to come here." Maris opened her eyes and signed back, her movements controlled but slightly tense. "I needed to know if I still could." Lyrene studied her. "And can you?" Maris hesitated, then nodded once. "For now." Lyrene's gaze softened. "Father wants to speak with you." Maris felt a familiar flicker of unease. The Sea King had never pressured her, but his presence carried weight all the same, like the deepest current, unseen but powerful. She followed Lyrene through the palace, upward this time, toward the king's audience chamber. As they swam, the sound gradually softened again, retreating into the background where it belonged. The Sea King awaited her alone. He sat upon a throne carved from pale stone and living coral, his crown a simple band of polished shell. His expression was calm, but his eyes, ancient and perceptive, held concern. "My daughter," he said gently, "you were near the surface." Maris inclined her head. "And in the Hall of Currents," he continued, "that is unexpected." Maris signed carefully, choosing her movements with the same deliberation she used with her thoughts. "The surface found me." The Sea King nodded. "And did it harm you?" Maris paused. "It hurt," she admitted, "but it also needed something." The Sea King leaned forward slightly. "Sound always needs something." Maris met his gaze steadily. "So does silence." The king studied her for a long moment. "You are restless." Maris did not deny it. "There are old laws," he said softly. "Not written, remembered. They exist to protect us." "From the surface," Maris signed. "And from ourselves," he replied. Maris's hands stilled. "What if protection becomes a cage?" The Sea King sighed, a sound like distant thunder rolling along the seafloor. "Your voice is powerful," he said. It always was. Power carries cost. Maris felt the weight of his words settle heavily in her chest. What is the cost? She asked. The Sea King did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached beneath his throne and withdrew a small object wrapped in kelp silk. He unwrapped it slowly, revealing a shell, smooth, iridescent, faintly glowing. A vessel, he said. Old magic, rarely used. Maris stared at it, her heart beginning to pound. It can hold a voice, the Sea King continued. Not destroy it, not steal it, preserve it. Understanding dawned slowly, painfully. So I could be silent, Maris signed, and still speak when necessary, the king finished. Maris's hands trembled slightly. What is the price? The Sea King's gaze softened, but his voice did not waver. Sound shapes us. To part with your voice, even willingly, is to part with a piece of how you touch the world. Maris thought of the young man clinging to wreckage, of his voice breaking, then softening, of how silence had steadied him when sound could not. And if I keep it? She asked. The Sea King closed his eyes briefly. Then the surface will hear you, and hearing is never without consequence. Maris reached for the shell, then stopped short. If I give my voice away, she signed slowly, I choose silence. Yes. And if I keep it, she continued, I choose pain. Possibly, the Sea King said. Possibly purpose. Maris withdrew her hand. She did not take the shell. Not yet. I will not decide today, she signed. The Sea King nodded. Wisely. Maris left the chamber and swam toward the outer reefs, her thoughts heavy and tangled. The sea around her felt different now, less like refuge, more like waiting. As she neared the boundary between palace and open water, she felt it again. A vibration. Not violent, not frantic. Familiar. She swam upward cautiously, her heart racing as she approached the surface. The water thinned. Sound sharpened. There, on a small outcropping of rock just above the waves, sat the young man. He looked pale, exhausted, wrapped in rough cloth, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He did not shout. He did not call. He waited. Maris hovered just below the surface, unseen, listening. The sea was loud here, the air harsher still. But beneath it all, she sensed something steady, an intention as quiet as her own. For the first time, Maris wondered not just what silence cost her, but what sound might demand in return. And somewhere between the roar of the surface and the hush of the depths, the choice began to take shape. Chapter 4. The Prince Who Loved the Quiet. Maris did not surface immediately. She lingered just beneath the waterline, hidden by the shifting skin of the sea, watching the young man from a place where sound blurred and edges softened. The waves rolled above her, breaking against the rocks with a rhythm she was learning to tolerate, not comfortably, but attentively. He did not shout her name. He did not call out in hope or desperation. He simply sat. That, more than anything, unsettled her. Humans were loud by necessity. They filled silence because silence frightened them. They spoke to prove they were still here, still alive, still seen. This one, however, seemed to understand something most never did, that waiting was not the same as asking. Maris hovered there for a long while, her tail moving gently to keep her in place. She listened to the uneven cadence of his breathing, the way he exhaled more slowly than he inhaled, as though teaching himself calm by repetition alone. At last she rose. She surfaced quietly, careful not to splash, letting the water part around her as gently as it could. The cold air brushed her skin again. Sharp, intrusive, but she held steady. The young man turned at the sound. His eyes widened, but only slightly. There was no cry, no flinch. Instead, relief softened his expression. the tension in his shoulders easing as though he had been carrying something heavy for longer than she knew. "You came back," he said. His voice was quieter than before. Still rough, still human, but controlled. "Considerate." Maris studied him for a moment before nodding once. He smiled faintly, then seemed to remember himself and lowered his gaze, as though not wishing to overwhelm her with attention. "I wasn't sure," he admitted. "I thought perhaps I imagined you." Maris shook her head gently. "I hoped you were real," he continued. "But I didn't want to shout into the sea and make it decide for me." The word struck her with unexpected force. "Make it decide for me." She slipped closer to the rock, resting her arms against its slick surface, keeping most of her body submerged. This distance felt right. Not hidden, not exposed. He noticed the boundary and respected it. "My name is Corin," he said after a moment. "I suppose I should have said that before." Maris hesitated, then lifted her hand and pressed it lightly to her chest. "Maris," she said. The sound of her own voice startled her. It was soft, far softer than she remembered. The water carried it away quickly, blurring its edges, but the vibration traveled through her chest like a memory awakened. Corin's eyes widened fully this time. "You speak," he said, almost reverently. Maris winced despite herself. The word "speak" landed too heavily. She nodded once, but her gaze drifted away, toward the open horizon where sea met sky in a pale, uncertain line. "Only when I must," she said quietly. Corin absorbed this without question. "Then I'll listen carefully." Something inside her loosened. They sat like that for a while, Maris half in the sea, Corin perched on stone, watching the gray light shift as clouds thinned and the day found its footing. Gulls cried overhead, their voices sharp but distant enough not to wound. Corin broke the silence gently. "I don't like noise," he said. Maris glanced at him, surprised. "I grew up in a court that never stopped talking," he continued. "Advice, commands, flattery. Everyone speaking over one another, afraid that if they stopped, they would vanish." Maris felt a familiar ache of recognition. "I used to think silence meant emptiness," Corin said. "But after the storm, when I was clinging to that beam, everything loud felt like danger. Quiet was the only thing that didn't hurt." Maris met his gaze then, truly looking at him for the first time. He was young, but there were lines of exhaustion already etched near his eyes, as though responsibility had arrived early and stayed too long. "You didn't scream when you saw me," she said softly. Corin smiled faintly. "I didn't want you to disappear." The simplicity of the truth struck her harder than any grand declaration could have. They met again the next day. And the next. Sometimes Corin spoke. Sometimes he didn't. Sometimes Maris answered in words. Sometimes she used her hands, her expressions, the subtle movements of water around her. Corin learned quickly, not the language itself, but the patience required to understand without interruption. He never asked her to sing. He never asked her why she stayed silent. He never asked her to come closer than she wished. One evening, as dusk painted the sea in muted gold and blue, Corin said, "I think you're the quietest person I've ever met." Maris smiled faintly. "I don't think that's true." He tilted his head. "No. You're quiet too," she replied. Corin laughed softly. "Only when I'm near you." The sound did not hurt. Days passed. Then weeks. Maris found herself hovering nearer the surface than ever before, her tolerance for sound slowly expanding, not because it grew quieter, but because she was no longer alone within it. Yet the question remained. One night, beneath a sky scattered with cold stars, Corin spoke again, his voice careful. "Will you have to choose?" he asked. Maris closed her eyes briefly. "Yes." He did not ask between what and what. He already knew. If you give up your voice, he said, will it be forever? Maris nodded. Most likely. And if you keep it? The surface will hear me, she replied, and it will want more than I can give. Corin looked out at the dark water, his jaw tightening slightly. I don't want to be the reason you lose yourself. Maris felt warmth bloom in her chest, unexpected and steady. You aren't, she said. You're the reason I'm considering not running. They fell silent again, the kind that rested comfortably between them. But beneath that calm, the tide pulled steadily toward decision. Deep below, the shell waited, and above, the surface world listened, unknowing, impatient, loud. Maris remained between them, suspended in the narrow place where quiet met sound, wondering which part of herself she would have to leave behind in order to belong anywhere at all. Chapter 5. The Sea That Would Not Take Her Back. The night the choice became unavoidable, the sea grew unnaturally still. Not calm, still. Waves no longer rolled with their usual rhythm. Currents slowed until they felt hesitant, as if the water itself were listening for something it had not yet heard. Even the surface winds quieted, leaving the ocean stretched smooth and reflective beneath a pale, watchful sky. Maris felt the change deep in her bones. She woke before the palace did, her body heavy with a sense she could not name. The familiar hush of her chamber felt different now, less like refuge, more like a pause held too long. She pressed her palm to the stone wall, grounding herself, letting the faint pulse of the sea steady her breathing. The shell waited. She did not need to look at it to know where it was. Its presence had threaded itself into her awareness since the day her father had shown it to her. A vessel for her voice. A promise of silence without erasure. A door that would close gently and permanently. Maris rose and swam slowly through the palace corridors, her movements deliberate, unhurried. The coral walls glowed softly as she passed, their light muted, respectful. Guards drifted aside without comment. No one stopped her. No one asked where she was going. They knew. She descended toward the king's chamber, but stopped before reaching it. Instead, she turned outward, following a lesser-used passage that led beyond the palace walls and into open water. The sea embraced her immediately, familiar and vast. She swam downward at first, instinctively seeking the depths where sound softened and pressure reassured her that she belonged. But when she reached the threshold of the still water, something resisted. Not forcefully, gently. The currents slowed her descent, as though the sea itself had placed a careful hand against her back. Maris frowned. She tried again, angling herself downward, pushing with her tail, but the water thickened, refusing to carry her farther. It was not a wall. It was an invitation denied. Understanding crept in, unwelcome but clear. The sea would not let her retreat. Her chest tightened. For the first time since she was a child, the depths did not open willingly to her. The still water, her sanctuary, her silence, hovered just beyond reach. Maris turned upward, heart pounding. She surfaced near the familiar rock where Corin often waited, though she had not expected him to be there. The sky above was dark but clear, stars sharp and distant. The air struck her skin cold and loud, but she barely noticed. Corin stood at the edge of the rock, his silhouette still against the sky. "You felt it too," he said quietly, not turning at first. Maris nodded, then remembered herself and spoke instead. "Yes." He faced her slowly. His expression was solemn, but not afraid. "The sea is holding its breath." Maris rested her arms against the rock, water lapping softly around her. "It won't let me go back," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. Corin swallowed. "Is that normal?" "No," Maris replied. "It means I've waited too long." Silence settled between them, not the gentle kind they had grown comfortable with, but something heavier, edged with inevitability. Corin broke it carefully. Your father's offer. Maris closed her eyes. Yes. If you take the shell, Corin said, you stay here, but apart. Maris nodded. Silent. Untouched by the surface. And if you don't? She opened her eyes and met his gaze. Then I speak. The word felt enormous. Corin looked away, his jaw tightening. And the world hears you. Yes. And it won't be gentle, he said. No, Maris agreed softly. It won't. She felt the truth of it settle into her chest like an anchor. The surface would not whisper back the way he did. It would demand. It would pull and stretch and claim pieces of her until she no longer knew where her silence had gone. I'm afraid, she admitted. Corin's voice was steady. So am I. Maris studied him, surprised. Of what? That if you choose silence, he said, you'll lose something you haven't had the chance to become. Her breath caught. And if I choose sound? She asked. Corin met her gaze again, his eyes clear. Then I'm afraid the world will ask more of you than it has the right to. They stood there, balanced between water and stone, choice pressing close on all sides. At last, Maris pushed away from the rock. I have to go, she said. Corin nodded. I know. She swam back toward the palace, her movements swift but controlled. The water parted for her now, no longer resisting, but it did not feel welcoming either. It felt expectant. She entered the king's chamber without announcement. Her father stood waiting, the shell resting in his open hands. You felt it? He said. Maris nodded. The sea will not hold you in stillness any longer, he continued. You must choose how you will remain. Maris approached slowly, her gaze fixed on the shell. Up close, it glimmered faintly, its surface alive with soft internal light. If I place my voice inside it, she said, I will never sing again. The Sea King inclined his head. No. And if I keep my voice, she continued, I will lose the quiet that has kept me whole. Yes. Maris reached out and then stopped. She thought of the storm, of Corin's broken breath, of how silence had steadied him when noise had nearly destroyed him. She thought of the still water and how it had taught her that rest was not weakness. And she thought of the surface, loud and relentless, and the way it did not know how to listen. Slowly, deliberately, Maris withdrew her hand. I will not give my voice away, she said. The words trembled, but they did not break. The Sea King closed his eyes briefly, then nodded. Then you accept what comes with it. Yes. He stepped aside, allowing her to pass. Maris swam from the chamber and did not look back. She rose through the palace, through the open sea, through the thinning water toward the surface that had once hurt too much to bear. Sound sharpened with every stroke, but she did not flinch. When she surfaced beside the rock again, Corin was there. She took a breath. And this time, when she spoke, she did not whisper. I'm staying, she said clearly, with my voice. Corin's breath caught, but he smiled, slow, careful, reverent. Then I'll stay too, he said, and I'll listen. Above them, the sea exhaled at last. Waves resumed their rhythm. Current stirred. The world began to move again. But beneath the noise, something new took shape, a quiet strong enough to exist within sound itself. And for the first time, Maris understood that silence was not something she had to lose. It was something she would now have to protect. Chapter 6. What remained when she chose silence? The sea did not change all at once. That was the first thing Maris noticed. There was no sudden stillness, no violent stirring of tides, no chorus of voices rising to greet her decision. The world did not pause to acknowledge the moment she chose to keep her voice. It continued, steadily, imperfectly, exactly as it always had. And yet, everything felt different. Maris remained near the surface through the night, resting against the familiar rock while Corin kept his quiet vigil beside her. Neither spoke much. They did not need to. The choice had been made, and its weight now settled gently, asking not to be explained but lived with. Stars reflected faintly across the water, broken and reshaped by every small movement of the tide. Maris watched them drift and reform, thinking how sound was much the same, never fixed, always changing, capable of becoming harsh or kind depending on how it was held. At dawn, the world found its voice again. Fishing vessels returned to the water. Gulls cried overhead. Wind brushed the surface, carrying with it the familiar chaos of the upper world. Maris winced once, but only once. She did not retreat. Instead, she listened. Not to everything. Not all at once. Just enough. Word traveled quickly, as it always does when the impossible brushes close to the ordinary. Sailors spoke of a girl in the waves whose voice carried calm instead of command. Some exaggerated. Some dismissed it entirely. But a few listened closely and changed how they spoke in return. Maris felt those shifts like distant vibrations, subtle but present. Sound did not always wound. Sometimes, when shaped with care, it healed. She returned to the Sea Kingdom days later. The palace received her quietly. There were no celebrations, no whispered accusations. Her sisters gathered around her with cautious warmth, studying her as though she were both familiar and new. "You sound different," Lyrene said softly. Maris nodded. "I learned where to place my voice." The Sea King met her alone beneath the high arches of the audience chamber. The shell rested on its pedestal, untouched, its glow dimmer now, as though acknowledging it would no longer be needed. "You chose sound," he said. "I chose balance," Maris replied. He regarded her for a long moment, then inclined his head, not as a ruler, but as a father who had raised a daughter brave enough to step beyond sanctuary. "The sea will not always be kind to you now," he said. Maris met his gaze steadily. "It never was. I just learned how to listen beneath it." She did not remain in the palace long after that. Maris became something new, something without a name. She swam between depths and surface, teaching those who would learn that quiet could exist within sound, that voices did not need to be loud to matter. She spoke to sailors stranded by storms, to children who listened better than adults ever had, to those who had forgotten how to be still. And when the noise grew too heavy, she returned to the deeper waters, not to disappear, but to rest. Corin visited when he could. Sometimes they spoke of small things, the shape of clouds, the way the tide carried light differently in winter. Sometimes they sat in shared silence, listening to the sea breathe around them. Their love did not declare itself loudly. It did not need to. It existed in patience, in listening, in the space between words where understanding lived. Years passed. Stories changed. Some said the mermaid had given up her voice for love. Others said she sang the sea itself to sleep. A few insisted she never existed at all. Maris did not correct them. Truth, she had learned, did not always need to be heard to remain true. One evening, long after the world had forgotten the storm that brought her and Corin together, Maris drifted once more into the still water. This time, the sea welcomed her. Silence wrapped around her, not as escape, not as refuge, but as something chosen and complete. She closed her eyes and rested there, her voice intact, her quiet intact, herself intact. Above her, the surface roared and sang and argued and loved. Below, the sea held her gently. And between the two, Maris remained, no longer divided between sound and silence, but whole within both. That was what remained. Not the loss of a voice. Not the sacrifice of quiet. but the understanding that rest and expression were never enemies, only partners waiting to be held with care. And in that balance, the sea continued on, patient as ever, carrying stories not just of what was spoken, but of what was finally understood.